So we are here today together because of the Collections as Data Part to Whole grant with funds from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, re-granted through the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. LSU Libraries and the Louisiana Digital Library is part of a cohort charged with creating examples of how to operationalize the use of digital cultural heritage materials as data. So we are thrilled to be part of this cohort. If you haven't yet had a chance to familiarize yourself with all the other great projects involved, we encourage you to do so at your convenience. Again, we're very, very lucky to be part of this. We are so happy. And our part of the Collections as Data Part to Whole project is investigating what it would mean to make the entirety of the Louisiana Digital Library available as data. So for context, the LDL is Louisiana's statewide digital repository for cultural heritage materials with over 30 participating institutions, including public libraries, academic libraries, archives, and museums. And we know a project of this scale and complexity will include both a technical angle in which we build out APIs and enable bulk downloads in various ways. And there's a lot of work and excitement happening just now in this area, but much more central to our project for our purposes today is the community work that this entails. Because we're thinking about what we can get out of the LDL in terms of data to use and reuse in various forms, we also need to think very carefully about what goes into the LDL. Doing so invites questions about digitization selection, conscientious metadata remediation, as well as evaluation of what collections should not in fact be widely shared, because we know not everything should be treated the same way. And it's because of these questions and many others like it that we have launched this speaker series. And because we know the LDL is not alone in this journey, we're happy to see such a great turnout from around the country and beyond. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to take a moment to invite you all to attend our full speaker series. You can find a complete list of guests on the link on the slide. We had an amazing first semester, and you can find recordings of our first 5 speakers on our YouTube channel. And I'll just briefly mention the next 2. Michelle Riley, professor and digital projects coordinator at the University of Arkansas, will join us in just over 2 weeks to talk to us about assessing users and reuses for LDL practitioners. She'll talk about how to better know digital collections users and needs by tracking use and reuse. So this is very important for those of us working in digital librarianship today. In closing out the series, Sharon Leon, associate professor of history and digital humanities at Michigan State University, will join us February 11th. And everyone who knows Sharon's work will know that this will be great. Additional information will be posted when it's finalized. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Brian Carpenter. Brian is the curator of Native American materials at the American Philosophical Society Library and Museum. Since 2008, Brian has worked with over 80 Native communities throughout North America to enhance their access to archival materials at the library and to receive their guidance on ways to improve the representation and uses of the collections. Brian's work focuses on gathering community input in order to, among other things, mitigate harmful archival descriptions and raise the visibility of community members, often rendered invisible in finding aids. Brian holds a BA in English from Seattle Pacific University, an MA in English in Poetics from the University of Maine, and a Master's of Library Science from Drexel University. And this is a special honor for me to introduce Brian. He and I worked at the APS library together for 8 years. And I admit, at first, I did not understand his work, right? So trained in the individualistic, positivist tradition of archival practice, it wasn't clear to me at first why we as a library and we as a profession couldn't simply do what we wanted with materials that were in our possession. I feel like my understanding on this front, my practice of digital librarianship, and frankly, my empathy in general has greatly benefited from my friendship with Brian. And now, Brian, I turn it over to you to talk to us about developing community collaborations and archival curation before, after, and besides digitization. Go ahead and stop my share now.
Thank you so much, Estelle, and to everyone there at the Louisiana Digital Library for inviting me, and thank you to everyone here today for joining us for this time. I'm going to share my screen and make sure that's working correctly first. Okay, always good to make sure that that's actually showing up. So yes, thank you to everyone for attending, and to Essel for the very kind introduction. I really appreciate that. So I'm here to talk about, to give a very broad overview of some kinds of things that we have been doing over the last decade or so here at the APS library. And I want to talk about a lot of the themes that have been prominent in this great series, the Louisiana Digital Library series, and hopefully it will connect with a lot of the other great talks that have already taken place, which I encourage people to look into if they haven't already. So in talking about an archival institution working with communities or connected to digital materials, digitization is a thing that often comes up. I kind of feel like there's a sense in doing archival work that kind of what isn't digitization, what isn't digitally involved in work, but I think there's actually quite a lot of that is actually is good to examine. One of the things that I want to convey here is that some of the points of doing digitization isn't just to do digital things, it's to create and to think about how we interact with materials and other than digital ways as well, such as creating physical versions of materials that people, because some people want to use that. So that's kind of what I'm gesturing to in this opening image here, which I unfortunately can't give you the full background on that particular story, which is a talk unto itself. But let's just start off with the sort of general question that was a good sort of summation of the topic here. How can archival institutions develop ongoing collaborative relationships with communities that have unique direct connections to particular archival materials? And what roles might digitization and curation play in this? So this is a good place to start, but let's start with, I also kind of zeroing in on a few of the terms that are kind of prominent in here that are, and these are terms that are used very widely and can mean a lot of different things. And that's natural, but I'm just going to give you some definitions here that are not, I'm not proposing as sort of definitions for the field or as comprehensive even of the work that I'm talking about here, but it's just to give you a sense of what I'm generally referring to when I use these kinds of terms in here. So by digitization, I'm just talking about the process of making digital preservation masters of things, whether that's manuscripts, photographs, sound recordings, making an archival version of that. And the metadata, the description, the information about it that goes with it, because you can't embed that all in just the file of things. So I'm just talking about that. I'm not necessarily talking about the other steps that kind of follow upon that, about access, about what's done with it next. I say that because sometimes when people say hear the term digitization in relation to archival matters, I think it means doing the scanning, the whatever, and then putting it up online in a digital library for general public use. Sometimes that is the sort of flow that things take. When I'm talking about digitization, I'm just talking about making the digital thing. Sometimes that's just of also preserving a thing that's already born digital. In talking about curation, which is really a term I don't want to focus on that much here at all, but I kind of mean I mean a much more general sense, not of the sense of creating, say, an online digital library or an exhibit or something like that. I just mean making sense of archival collections for a variety of researcher interaction scenarios. Researchers, people interested in archival collections, come at it in a lot of ways. And some of these we can think of ahead of time, we can conceive of ones, we can plan for some, and sometimes people come at and learn about archival collections in other ways as well. When I'm talking about this broadly, when my title is curator, I take emphasis that I am an archivist here. I'm not coming at this as a sort of researcher from a particular field. So when I talk about curation, I think about all of the archival processes are involved in curation. And I'm especially keen on emphasizing how we describe and redescribe materials is key, and how we do reference, how do we explain what's in the collections when people are asking about it. Those are really key parts of curation. A community, I mean a group with unique direct connections to specific archival materials because of who created those materials and who is represented in them. I don't just mean people who are really interested in a particular topic. It's not to denigrate that. I just mean that there are ways people might talk about the scholarly community or the such and such community who's focused in on a particular discipline or subject. Here, I mean actually people who are connected to it, that materials from a particular community, family connections, things like that. In this talk, I'll be talking about Indigenous communities specifically because that's where my area of experience is. But certainly for people who are attending, who are members of different kinds of communities, who are archivists at different institutions, who may have other kinds of collections, not necessarily Indigenous related ones or those alone. We may be able to think of other kinds of communities to which what I'm going to say here may apply. And I think that a lot of what I'll say will have applications, though some of the specifics that are specific to considerations about Indigenous history, Indigenous materials, and so forth. It'll vary, but I want to sort of gesture at different points that this may apply to other kinds of communities. So I'll be talking specifically about Indigenous communities. So the other theme here is developing relationships. When people say, well, should archives develop relationships with communities connected to materials? People say, yes, of course, developing relationships sound good. That requires accessibility. This is yet another term that we use in archives and libraries that refers to a lot of things, from creating sort of user-friendly interfaces to having clear descriptions of collections, policies allowing people to use things that they don't have to jump through hoops. But accessibility, all that's true, but accessibility, in order for people to engage with all those things you might have in place to accessibility, you have to have approachability. People have to know that they can ask for those things. And for a lot of institutions, especially heavily colonial ones, heavily sort of imposing looking and sounding ones, people may not know that they are allowed to do so. People, especially people who have been traditionally just treated as subject matter, not as constituencies of archives. And Indigenous communities are certainly and that's very much the case. So that's also a theme that will come up here. And so at the APS, this issue of approachability is especially prominent because we have things like imposing buildings, we have names. The name doesn't sound like what it is. It's very unclear from the name what actually the institution is. The APS does a lot of things other than the library and museum component, but it's one of the more prominent aspects of it. So I think this issue affects all sorts of institutions, but at APS it's particularly pronounced and on steroids in some cases, so it sort of brings some things into focus in that respect. So let's talk about the context of what the APS is, because it is really not, as I said, it's not apparent from the name. It sounds like it is a society for philosophers in America, American Philosophical Society, and indeed we're often confused as like a professional organization. And this is very understandable. So to backtrack, here's our library hall here in Philadelphia, and I should say that we're located here in Philadelphia, which is the traditional territories of the Lenape people. Lenape-Hoking is the homeland of the Lenape people. Philadelphia is one part of that broader region, and we have the good fortune and honor to be able to work with a lot of Lenape communities, and our work is based upon the generosity of them and lots of other Indigenous communities and organizations that make all this work possible. So I want to frame it that way as well. We're founded in 1743, essentially by a group of white businessmen who were interested in things that we would now refer to as things like the natural sciences, things of that sort. Broadly speaking, those types of things at that time were referred to as natural philosophy. So it's philosophy in that sense, more of the sciences, applied sciences and so forth, by Benjamin Franklin and others who were the founders. One of the key reasons why there are white Indigenous languages, especially our focus, is one of the early people involved with the APS was Thomas Jefferson, who was president of APS before, during, and after he was president of the United States. So when he, for example, put together the Lewis and Clark expedition, he brought Lewis to the APS to learn what was known about the Louisiana territory, which was very little actually was known. But one of the other things that that Jefferson was doing, he created a word list of terms he thought would be universal to all human languages, and because he wanted to figure out how native languages worked. So he created this broadside, 200 some terms, sent it out to anyone he thought would be in touch with Native people, so diplomats, missionaries, military people like Lewis and Clark and so forth. And then he tried to compile these to figure out how these were related. This wasn't just an intellectual exercise, this was also military intelligence. It's important to understand because he used a lot of this to try to understand who was related to each other, who were friends and enemies as he construed that, and developed federal Indian policy from that, which had genocidal consequences. You can also see that in that some of the people who were the sources of the language terms were people like Little Turtle, who was a Miami leader who basically kicked the butt of the American Army for a number of years in Ohio and came to Philadelphia, and actually the word list was written down in Philadelphia from him directly. There's also an idea that even at Jefferson's time that you had to write down these languages because they were going to go away. I can say that of the word lists that are in this comparative one that Jefferson compiled, of the 23 languages that are on this particular list, we've worked with 20 of the contemporary language communities in the last 10 years. So much more to say about that. Don't want to dwell too much on it, but subsequently in sort of the early 19th century, the APS became the primary place to study indigenous languages in the world through people like Peter Stephen Dupont-Seau, who said, okay, people like Jefferson, okay, well, you need to put these manuscripts in a common library where people can come to look at them. And Dupont-Seau worked with native speakers such as Kana Pima here, Augustine Hamlin, who was an Udawa leader. Not much happened for the rest of the 19th century in that area. With the turn of the 20th century, I'm skipping over, I'm summarizing a lot of things here, over generalization. In the turn of the 20th century, where there was the rise of the anthropology and linguistics formed as professional disciplines. One of the strains of it was an Americanist form of anthropology, championed by people like Boas, who's very hard to summarize as well. But the key thing I want to point out is that one of the aspects of Boas's methodology was to say that indigenous languages and cultures need to be understood in their own terms, not in reference to other cultures, as a sort of social, as like a social hierarchy, white supremacist kind of thing. So this involved a lot of documentation. They still have the mentality that you got to do this because it's all going to go away, which also proved not to be true. But this resulted in a massive increase in documentation done by outsiders. The sort of classic, iconic version of this are these field notebooks of language materials. These are some of Boas's showing these sort of interlinear text, which we'll see in a little bit. Method for recording language material from with speakers. And this really happened in conjunction with where various nation states, Western settler states were expanding, where resource extraction was happening and so forth. And this is an ongoing thing. A lot of the materials from that period were brought together at the APS after Boas' death. He wanted them to go all to a single place. That's another story as well. So the collections at the APS, we are the oldest and one of the largest repositories of materials relating to indigenous languages, cultures, history, ongoing presence in peoples, especially in North America, Central America, all sorts of kinds of materials, going from much earlier back to the 1500s and to the present day. Sometimes when I say it's through the present, people think I mean like the 80s. I think, no, it's today. And it's many hundreds of cultures and lots of audio material and other types of things. It's from throughout North America. We have a subject guide, which is our main way we suggest for getting started to evaluate the collections. I won't talk much about that today, but that's there in case people want to take a look. And the library founded a Center for Native American and Indigenous Research, which is the component of the library that I work in now. This was officially founded in 2014, but it was really as an extension of work that had already been happening. Basically, the library said there's a lot of good grant projects. from which we had started to do a lot of our early collaborations with a number of communities, and they said this should really become a permanent component of the library. So they were very fortunate to have very good development and donors, and we were able to endow the center. Majority of our requests come from Indigenous communities, whether that's community entities like cultural centers, language programs, historic preservation offices, or from just individual people saying, I Googled my grandfather's name and I found this photograph, like, who are you philosophers and how can I get a copy? And things like that. So we do digitize materials for free in support of community-based initiatives. This is a good thing for context in relation to, I think it was in Dorothy Berry's talk, she was talking about the problems of just doing ad hoc digitization, just basing your digitization, what you put up based upon requests you get. At different institutions, as she said, that can really turn into very skewed, one-sided, non-representative presentations of of historical materials. In our case, since a lot of the materials is influenced by what we receive, and the majority of our requests are from Indigenous communities, I think we're less subject to that, but there are still gaps that determine, we don't purely do digitization responsively, but though that we can barely keep up with that alone. So that's some of the background of how digital materials get created here. We have fellowships to help people come to the library, specifically community fellowships. Do not require people to have graduate degrees and things like that. We have protocols for treatment of Indigenous materials that govern how we evaluate and understand what is culturally sensitive and should be restricted, and processes for doing that. And we're working with many Indigenous communities, Native nations across the continent. The number kind of fluctuates from year to year, but it's all over the place. So I want to spend the sort of middle portion of this talk going through a few examples. It's very hard from all of the communities we work with. It's hard to choose just three, but I think these three kind of will help to bring out some insights, some things to think about that may be applicable to other kinds of communities, including some non-Indigenous community type of scenarios that archivists and people interacting with archivists can think about. So the first I want to talk about is the Tunica-Biloxi tribe of Louisiana, and that's not just because I'm giving a talk here with the Louisiana Digital Library, but this is one of the most prominent and active partnerships we're working on right now. To first talk about, and I think some folks from Tunica-Biloxi tribe are tuning in today, so thank you very much to all of you for attending. So I'll talk about the materials are in the 1930s. A linguist named Mary Haas worked for a number of years with Mr. Sostruyuchigat, who you see here on the left, who was the last known fluent speaker of Tunica. And he, together with him giving the guidance and the knowledge, Haas recorded but 14 notebooks of language material. I don't remember the exact page number, but 2,000 plus pages of stories, various kinds, lots of just what they call elicitation, like how do you say these kinds, figuring out how different kinds of grammar and phrases and wordless terms work, and lots of cultural information along the way. So this is the most prominent, most extensive body of material on Tunica language that was ever recorded. There are others, but I'm told that this is definitely the most extensive, and I'm told it's one of the most insightful as well. Haas is thankfully, her handwriting is thankfully very good and very easy to work out, and she had very orderly notebooks. So we've been working with the tribe since I think about 2013 or 14, and had earlier on, they'd known about this material for, of course, a long time. The collection had been unprocessed for quite a while. So we had been able to make scans over the years of that and share those. But as our digitization got better, there was more and more that people wanted to do, especially the people at the Language and Cultural Revitalization Program, and linguists with whom they've worked for a number of years through the Tulane's Tunica Language Project. So the one of the things that people wanted to do was to transcribe all the information in the notebooks. And this is a huge process that you can't just do. So what we decided we would do through discussions over a few years was to apply for a grant, which we were eventually able to get through the National Science Foundation's Dynamic Language Infrastructure Program. And the gist of the project is to spend the first year transcribing all of the notebooks through a particular system that's called Flex, which is one that allows you to, that's designed for transcribing and analyzing and creating various kinds of data for linguistic material, especially the way kind of linguists structure these things. And so it's inputting into that so that we can then create, we can make the notebook searchable so that the transcription can be used to search not just through the transcript, but also in reference to the original notebook, because there's a lot of contextual information in the original scans that you can't get from a transcript alone. So it's to show those side by side to make it, people be able to zero in on things that they want to find in the notebooks, and to allow for linguists and for the language teachers, language experts to try to create new materials out of yet more materials beyond those that they've already created from the notebooks. And from this to then in the second year, create a more of a portal from which people can interact with the notebooks with additional contextual information from cultural and language experts there at the tribe, commentary, context of a variety of kinds, as well as, and there will also be a component by which the linguist, Patricia Anderson, who's the lead linguist on project, will be doing some additional layers of analysis in the Flex program that will be downloadable as a kind of open and shared data so that other linguists can work on it. We talked with the tribe and said this is information that can be shared publicly. If things come up that through analysis that should not be shared, that they're not for general public use, those will be not included in the public portal. And from working with especially Donna Puri at the language program, Elizabeth Puritt-Mora and John Barbary at the language cultural revitalization program, we're understanding ways to construct this along the way. And a lot of the work is being done by, the transcription is being done by Tunica community members, including language apprentices. They have this language apprenticeship program, including people like Ryan Lopez, you see here on the left doing some transcription, and other community members who are at different stages of learning and studying the language. And we wanted to also use this project as a way to create not just a one-off project for this, but also as a way that we can then utilize that kind of interface as a way of, for other language materials, other kinds of notebooks and materials that other communities, if they want to do it in this kind of way, this will kind of help be generative of some ideas for how that can be applied to other archival materials. So I want to pull out just a few kind of themes to think about from this particular one. And I want to do this for each of my examples here. So the one thing I want to bring into focus here is that in doing developing a relationship with a community, it's important, it's really useful, obviously, to have concrete projects with clear steps. It's also a very important step to get to the point where you can get everyone to decide who are the correct people to be talking with, to be working with, who sort of can say, yes, we as a community would like to, or this department would like to work with you on this, to get people together and to articulate big goals. But I don't know about you, I've had many meetings with a variety of people internally and externally, where you can have a meeting where you have really big goals, but then you get to the next week and you're like, okay, what's the next little thing that I do? So the advantage of having a big project is you can kind of break that down into some more incremental steps. But it's also, the point of having a relationship is also to get things done. So you want to think of this balance of, yeah, you want to get a project done, but also when the project's done, you don't want that to be the end of things. So while you're doing it, also think of what's going to happen beyond this. So thinking of that balance, how you can continue things while also getting things finished as well. I think it's also important that there are lots of communities have been doing projects on their own with archival materials for years, or with external people like academic scholars, like linguists and so forth. And I think it's important for archives to know about that, and to look for projects where archives can be one of the people contributing to the project itself, not just saying, well, here's the material and then see you later. Also finding ways that insights that communities and other people they're working with that they do from archival collections can then come back to the archival setting as well, for people who are interacting with archival materials in that setting. So I've like to try to think of projects where that can be done. Not every project's of that nature, but look for ways where everyone can kind of contribute a component. It's good for projects to be structured around community goals, be community directed, not an archive coming in and saying, hey guys, we thought of this thing already, here's the full idea, what do you think? On the other hand, it's also not a great idea to say, hey, just tell us what you want to do and we'll do it, because that can put a lot of pressure on the folks you want to work with. It's good to be directed and follow what their objectives are, but also bring some ideas to the table and your own things, and there may be common ways that those can be brought together. Now, grants obviously provide a good structure for that, but I don't want the lesson here to be just like, we'll get a grant and then you can do it. Obviously, if you want to do things at a large scale, some kinds of projects will require that, but also in putting together grants or big projects, you can try to pack in a lot of individual components in there and then wait years to get the whole thing done. Whereas in the meantime, you could get a lot of that preparatory, smaller scale stuff done that may not require a big grant funding kind of thing. So try to see if you can peel off some of the more easily smaller achievable ideas that get you towards larger things. I know that's easier said than done, but this is a realization that I had in putting this together over a few years. Another example I'd like to talk about is Six Nations of the Grand River. So this is the largest Indigenous reserve in Canada. It's about an hour and a half if you drive west from Buffalo, or an hour south of Toronto. But though in saying it's the largest reserve in Canada, reserves in Canada are very small. And I invite people to read more about the history of Canadian government's relations with Indigenous peoples in Canada, which I think we in the US do not really understand is equally terrible. But for what I want to talk about here is the materials from Six Nations, the Grand River, are, there's probably more materials from there or relating to there than any other place among what's at the APS. So people may have heard of the Iroquois Confederacy. They're often referred to that way. Haudenosaunee is the name that more often preferred to use now, Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is also sometimes called the Six Nations, because it consists of 6 nations, and Six Nations of the Grand River Territory is a particular community that happens to, where people from all 6 happen to live. There are many other Haudenosaunee communities of some of the other individual nations, both in the US and Canada. So the materials at the APS that are related to Six Nations of the Grand River specifically are all sorts of things, from colonial era documents, of various kinds, through 20th century things, and all kinds of formats that you can think of: photographic, written, audiovisual, linguistic, historical, anthropological, all sorts, many kinds of things. So in working with, we've had good fortune to work with couple of institutions there, especially the Deohahage Indigenous Knowledge Center at Six Nations Polytechnic and the Woodland Cultural Center, both of which are community run. The sort of governance of it is a little different, but in each case. But the Indigenous Knowledge Center at Six Nations Polytechnic is a comprehensive resource center for things like Haudenosaunee historical information, language. It is the main educational institution at Grand River. And one of the core parts of the IKC, the Knowledge Center, is basically an archive. Not basically, it is an archive that is in part compiled from resources that are held at external archives, such as places like the APS, as well as quite a bit of stuff that's just from the community directly, of course, as well. So, well, from working with folks at the Indigenous Knowledge Center, what we've been doing over the years is to digitize things that had not already been digitized, basically to get everything that's from the Grand River relates to Grand River and to Haudenosaunee history generally and languages there, to be locally available through there and co-stewarded. With the Woodland Cultural Center, it's the same thing, but their archive is specifically more focused on things relating to what they call Ongwehongwe civilization and traditions, longhouse ceremony, those matters, which are often or almost always restricted as a kind of private information. And so they wanted to, in part, develop an archive there so that people who have that kind of information, have those kinds of community created resources, can have a repository for them. Especially ceremonial leaders can have a repository for them locally. That's one way of summarizing. So we're working with both of those institutions, and they work together as well because they have a lot of shared collections as well. In working with folks there, one of the things that one person in particular named Rick Hill, who was one of the founders of the Indigenous Knowledge Center, which, by the way, is celebrating its 10th year today, very recently, I think last month. He pointed out that when in starting to talk to the APS, that there's actually some latent relationships we need to understand between us. Benjamin Franklin, who founded the APS, in the same year that he was a British colonial official, in the same year that he was founding the APS, he was publishing treaty minutes of negotiations between British and the Six Nations. So our connections with implicit connections with latent connections with Six Nations go back at least that far. And in sort of beginning that relationship, he did this, Rick's there on the right, by gifting us a wampum belt on one of my visits up there, which is a way of representing what the relationship would be. And it's also the agreement itself. And as he explains it, there's a video where he explains this in more detail. That's on our website. We have on each end of the belt here, we have our respective places, our traditions, and there's the line connecting us, an implicit relationship that connects us that we may not have always understood, but we need to recognize that it's here. And we're each holding our ends of it. And when we need something, we're going to pull it and ask, and you can do that in turn. So it's important to look for if the community you want to work with has its own ways of how to represent that relationship and how to enter into it, to look for those types of things. And what are ways that you can maintain them as well. So my colleague Tim Powell, who passed away a couple of years ago and really founded the center and started all of this work, and wouldn't have happened without him. He returned to Six Nations on one of our trips and with Rick to talk again over the wampum belt, which is a traditional way that wampum is used to sort of remind each other of what the agreement, to return and return back into that way of thinking. So in thinking about this example, I want to encourage other archives to think of ways that they can work with local archives and communities to co-steward collections, so that the materials that they want to use, they're not just getting copies from your archive, that they're able to actually put them into their archive directly as well and use them in the same way. And so people in the community want to actually just go to their local archive to use it, that they can do that at the community archive. And to center your digitization, there are cases where you can center your priorities around that, especially with the Six Nations material, the Grand River material. There's a lot, it wasn't one that core thing, the way the Mary Haas, the Tunica material was kind of a very sort of clear, overwhelmingly singular set of material, but use what their sort of access priorities, but people's research interests are as a way of guiding what your own digitization is. And digitization here, yeah, it doesn't mean putting things just online. It means some things need to be restricted and not put up directly, or you need time to evaluate that. That's also part of curation. And in communities interacting and working with the materials that they're getting from your archive, there may be already doing stuff like redescription and identification of photos of stuff. And so to ask about that, and that may, I'm speeding through this because I'm going a little long, but also to understand that community isn't a single thing. We talk about community like it's one thing. In communities, especially larger ones, there's lots of different people with lots of different interests that they're working on. They have different relationships to parts of that material, and they might have different obligations, especially with certain kinds of knowledge that's in these materials. Some people, it's their duty to take care of that kind of information. So in talking about community, it's important to not abstract that as like some singular thing that you can just talk to one person and that's like, that's it. So one more example, to do as quickly as I can, is to talk, we've had the good fortune to work with the Kwakwaka'wakw communities, Kwakwaka'wakw. I'll tell you a little bit about what this building is, but to give you a little bit of orientation, the northeast corner of the United States may be a sort of familiar shape here. You can see on the left the Washington State. Well, just north of there is, of course, British Columbia and Vancouver Island. So the large map here sort of shows you what Kwakwaka'wakw traditional territories are, the areas within the sort of thin dotted lines are all of the individual Kwakwaka'wakw tribes. There's, I think, 15 or 17. So the point here is this is a very large geographic area. This is a lot of different individual communities that are interrelated. Kwakwaka'wakw means people who speak Kwakwala. So there's lots of family relations, but there's also distinct communities and distinct clans and families and so forth within these that have individual say over things that they're responsible for. There's a very large body of material that was, a lot of it was written down by George Hunt, who worked with that anthropologist Franz Boas. George Hunt was Tlingit. He married into one of the communities. He was a fluent speaker, and over about 35, 40 years, he wrote down several thousand pages of material in the Pakwala language, a lot of which was published by Boas, not all of it though. Information about place names as well. Sort of just a little snippet of a page from George Hunt. You can see there's the classic interlinear text where you have one line of the language and then the corresponding parallel English. But he did a lot of things that didn't make it into the published works. There's little drawings, like he's talking about here about how to, I think, fillet a halibut or something like that. So there's lots of things mixed into that. So we were invited by a couple of hereditary chiefs, 2 consecutive years. We said, how can we make sense of all this material? Because people want access. People have a general sense that it's over there in Philadelphia. They said, well, we each have to hold a potlatch. So why don't you digitize a bunch of stuff and then print books so that we can give them away at the potlatch, which is a gathering which a hereditary chief, someone in that position, gives away materials. So we got a good deal at the Staples in North Victoria. If you ever need books printed for a potlatch, talk to Sami at Staples there. He's good. My friend Deanna Nicholson recommended it. And we drove up island to Alert Bay, and we were able to, we'll give these over to in first case, it was Michael Willey at the first potlatch, and it was Ryan Nicholson or Guimalas at the second potlatch. And they in turn gave those copies away to, first and foremost, other hereditary chiefs, matriarchs, singers, and adult members of the community. So this was, I'd like to talk more about that, but respecting the time, some takeaway points. The point of digitization is also to create digital things, not just to create digital things and interactions, consider other ways you can do it. A lot of the people who wanted to look at those materials are elders who, no matter how great a website you make, how great your metadata is, all the bells and whistles, they're not going to interact with it the same way. So actually printing out books and giving a few hundred copies away is actually a result that gets more people interacting with those archival materials than even the best website you might come up with. So try to look for examples of doing things other than the digital. One thing that was very clear with working with many folks there, which this has changed a bit in subsequent years, from working with people directly is that many community members may think they have to go through third parties in order to access archival materials. And the third parties they're working with, like external scholars, may think that too. And this is a reasonable impression that people can have, even if it's no longer true, because this has been the overwhelming history of how archival institutions, most of them, have dealt with people who do not have academic credentials, etc. And also knowledgeable community members may not always want to advise the archive because they don't want to be misunderstood as speaking on behalf of the community. People have had bad experiences of an archive saying, oh, well, we decided to do X thing because so-and-so said so, and that person wasn't saying so because they thought that they had the authority to speak for everyone. So people may be reluctant to avoid that if they're not sure that an archive understands the difference. And archival materials can have consequences beyond just sort of things that we're used to as archivists and archivists, sort of research scenarios that we're used to, like historical research, publishing books, articles. Some of these materials in these communities have implications on resource extraction. In BC, British Columbia, majority of the province, there were never any treaties signed. So all these traditional territories that we saw earlier, those are unceded territories. And there's a variety of resource extraction industries, such as fish farms, you see here, that are a major concern. And what its anthropological records from 100 years ago say have big consequences in legal settings as to what happens in these kinds of situations. So don't buy farmed fish. I have to say that here as well. So if you're going to want to develop community relations, the first thing you got to ask is how will it benefit the community? If you're doing outreach, you need to be able to answer that question before you do outreach. Reference is outreach. If you have gaps between that, try to shrink those at your institution. Compensate people for their labor. Don't just rely on people doing it because they're generous. Not everyone's going to want a relationship. Some people may just want the stuff and that'll be it, so let that be. Don't reach out. Do your very best to ensure that the first time you're getting in touch with people is not to say, hey, we've got this really big problem we need you to help us with. Even if there is such a thing, try to get in touch before that. You don't need to be an expert. You probably are not an expert. You really are needed to be useful. I can recommend having profound pancake dinners with people, breakfast with people like you're seeing here. There's a long story behind this picture, but and your relationships are an obligation. So think about what is the labor involved in maintaining that beyond the just getting a particular project done. I've gone on long, but I would just say although I'm put up here as though I'm an expert on this particular topic, I know there's a lot missing here, and a lot of people who are talking here from other places have insights in other communities that they work with and at other archival institutions. So I'm going to end there and say thank you again to SL and everyone at LDL, and thank you to everyone who's attending for your very kind attention, and I'm glad to answer questions in the time remaining.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brian, so much for that. I feel like there's just an awful lot to take from that, and if we had more time, I think the Q&A could go for a while. What I would do right now is invite anyone who would like to ask a question or actually make a comment too, I suppose. Please feel free to use the chat. And again, my colleagues, Leah and Dre, will help us moderate those. While we wait for people to collect their thoughts though, Brian, I have a question for you. You know, I'm really struck by so much of what you said, but mostly, I shouldn't say mostly, but particularly and early on, your comments about accessibility and accessibility as approachability. And you're using the sort of grandiose nature of the APS as an example of how perhaps things are not as approachable there as they could be. I think a lot of us think a lot about this in the terms of archives and special collections and everything from the emails that we send to the policies that we have if you want to come in, to the jargon that we use and finding aids, to the links that we send and count that as being done with a particular reference in a reference question by email, etc. Could you talk a little bit about sort of the holistic nature of approachability, right? So like if you're talking to somebody who's never been in an archive before, probably never been to Philadelphia before, really doesn't, you can't just send a link to a finding aid and call it a day. I'm sure that's a skill that took a long time to work on. I'm just interested in any brief thoughts you have on that.
Yes, it's a big question. Yeah, I think it's just a general not to assume people becoming, when you're in your job, it's very hard to understand what things are not clear. Terms like even down to basic terms like finding aid. Sometimes it's better to say collection guide because that's a little clearer about what it actually means. Or I think the key overall thing is follow up. There may be an initial question and then you send it, and if you don't hear back, people to say, did you get that okay? Did you have everything you need? I've had many experiences of people like me, for example, have well, those printouts are a good example. I've worked with a lot of people older generation who are they give me a phone call and they're like, how do I, I've heard that this thing is there. How do I get that? Not going to require them necessarily to go through the whole registration system and then learn how to do their login and then reset their password and so forth. There are some, don't get me wrong, there are some elders who just snap right through that and like it's not a problem. But sometimes it's like part of the holistic thing is, can you, in terms of fulfilling requests, can you get things to people in other ways? If you have digital audio, do you have a capacity to send someone a CD if they would rather listen to it on a CD? You should be able to do that. It is extra labor. You can't do that all the time. It takes longer, but being able to do things like that. Not overwhelming people with information all at once. Archivists are very good at creating big lists, and I'm very guilty of this. And sending it all at once, great. But you may need to space that out. Don't assume people understand everything. People may feel embarrassed about that they can ask about a particular thing. Try to find opportunities to not just be an institutional person. Those are just a few things that come to mind, and I think part of the holistic thing is for an institution like ours, is putting a face to it. Understand, like, here's the person, here's the face of the person you can talk to, not just here is Ben Franklin in a toga looming over you from 20 feet above. That may be beneficial for conveying some ideas of history, but in terms of people wanting to come in and engage with history and materials that are connected to, it's not effective for that. So personalizing being a person. I'll think of something else much better afterwards to say.
No, that was great, and I think resonates with a lot of us, right? Like we think about the jargon that we use and the policies. You mentioned registering. All of us who are saddled with, or who are lucky enough to use all sorts of fancy software for our registration. We do know that can be something of a burden for people brand new to all of this. I do appreciate you saying that. I am not seeing any questions come in. Leah, I think you can confirm that. Oh, wait, we do have one happening soon.
Michelle Beeson wrote to me that she loves the reminder of collaboration, implying relationship rather than just declarations. So I went ahead and shared that.
One just came in.
Mm-hmm. Heaven Smith says, when thinking about archival repositories and communities collaborating, can you explain more about how these collections might exist at both institutions beyond digitized materials? Beyond
digitized materials. The primary way that we are doing that is, yes, through digital sharing of materials, so that they can have basically a mirror of what we have here. And so people can access that material directly, locally. We have so far almost no requests for original materials. that is often thought of as a very common kind of request that's received. That is probably one that we get less than 1% of the time. We have new policies for deaccessioning materials that are culturally sensitive. That's a new policy. If that is a method that's wished for. Overall, most communities who we have worked with so far, the object itself is not so much the point as access to the information and the ability to use it freely, not subject to the whims of the archive, to have say over their own intellectual property. I think we have had scenarios where there are like exhibitions of original materials that are locally, like there were some of the George Hunt materials were recently in an exhibition in Alert Bay at the cultural center there. Those scenarios beyond digital materials really haven't come up yet, I guess would be the short version to say that. With a lot of born digital material now, like we're starting to do some projects with communities where they are, like with Mississippi Band of Choctaw, where they're creating born digital materials, documenting their own speakers, and we're basically co-archive. The agreement is to co-archive with them, but they are the owners of the. So in that sense, with born digital stuff, there's no like original, so to speak, but they're the primary owner of the intellectual property. So we're just another access point for them in that case. And we'd definitely like to find some more ways to do sort of shared exhibits and exhibitions and things like that. Yeah, that's kind of why we're creating a thing like this NSF project. People often say, yeah, we'd love to do a shared thing, or we'd love to sort of create biographies of prominent people who are who created the archival materials there. Those important people in our history and our speakers. Do you have an example of how that's been done? So and without a lot of sort of working examples already up, that's often things get kind of solved there. So having a working one format through this manuscript interface will hopefully be generative of other possible ways for other communities who might want to put together projects.
Caroline asked, when you're working with a community and someone from the community gets back to you that something you have shouldn't be made public, can you give an idea of how that conversation might go? Do you take things down and then talk about whether or not it should be taken down or something else?
Sure. We've had that scenario come up a number of times. A lot of the stuff that's restricted to stuff we kind of preliminarily already do based upon guidance on kinds of things that are generally problematic. So a lot of stuff is sort of preemptively identified as potentially sensitive, and then we take it to people there and say, is that the correct way of doing that? And sometimes they'll say, yes, this stuff should be restricted, but this other stuff is fine, don't worry about it. But there's this other stuff over here that is that you didn't know about that is problematic, and it's okay, you didn't know about that, but now we're telling you. So we've had some things may not jump out. So we had a particular historic preservation officer from a tribe in California who's coming here looking at some language materials that just appeared to be wordless language terminology stuff. But when he looked through it, he said, actually, some of the terminology here is about ceremonial stuff that's really private information. That's even within the community itself. It's only really intended for certain people within it. It's just another sense of private info. And so we treat that in the same sense that if someone was looking through non-Indigenous collections that said, hey, there's a folder here that has a bunch of medical information or financial or legal information, we would restrict that as well and then take a look at it again to make sure that our understanding is correct. But in the cases of Indigenous cultural knowledge, I haven't encountered a scenario where we're able to say, no, that's not true, that's not sensitive, because we don't really have the cultural authority to say that. Mm-hmm. There are some cases where things are reviewed and we can kind of distinguish it, say, hey, the first part of this notebook is restricted, but the second half is fine, so that part can go up. So there's a lot of different scenarios that can come into play.
I know we are a few minutes past 11. Do you have time for perhaps one final question?
Yes, of course.
Okay, Sarah's curious to hear more about the interplay between the personalization you're describing, such as the way individuals can build and maintain relationships, and then what seems like a separate but related institutional commitment. How have you seen institutions maintain relationships and commitments beyond the individuals initially involved?
That happens. The institutional commitment needs to happen through individuals for sure. I think that we're starting to do that, like Tim Powell, who founded CNAR and who I worked with. He was really leading this over time, was trying to make sure that it didn't just start and stop with him being there. So he was teaching me ways to carry out and do the same work on a lot of that personal interaction type of stuff, but also working with higher ups who may at various kinds of levels, other positions, funders, advisory boards, things like that, oversight committees, who may get the general idea of the goals, but to say, well, in order to it's very hard to give a real precise example, but it is to find repeated places where someone who may not have been around, especially at a sort of governance level, may not have been around in an earlier stage when things were real, to have really experience why a particular sort of personalized reference methodology is important to maintain in order to maintain those goals that are in the mission statement. It's important to look for opportunities to convey that, because they too may not, you can't assume that they will understand that we have the curator doing reference requests because that's how we maintain, that's how relationships come into place. That's how they're maintained. We don't separate the outreach person from the sort of core archival processes, because that's necessary to make all of this work. If that doesn't happen, then those broader institutional goals that we've articulated actually can't come into place. So it's trying to connect sort of big mission things to actual processes, and always look ahead. So who will be the next people doing that to the extent possible on multiple levels? I hope that speaks to that somewhat.
Okay, thank you, Brian, for everything, this entire presentation. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for everything that we will be learning from you as we think about this presentation and hopefully go back and watch it, because again, there's so much to get from this. What I'll do now is thank everybody who came to this, thank everybody who's watching this as a recording. I do hope that you take advantage of all the other great LDL as Data Speaker Series events that are recorded and available, and you can see the overlap that Brian has been very, very good about teasing out. I think this has been absolutely fantastic. As always, reach out on Twitter, via email, or any other way if you have any questions, suggestions, or just want to chat with the Louisiana Digital Library. And have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.